Hello, thanks for joining me. This is the first of two lectures I'll do on the question of euthanasia or medical assistance in dying. The plan for today is to first do some background, go over some important distinctions, some important historical landmarks, as well as some of the recent history of medical assistance in dying in Canada. And then I'll discuss the idea of the doctrine of sanctity of life. And then for the next lecture, we'll talk about arguments surrounding autonomy and well-being. So first, just to say something about the word euthanasia. So it's not a very funny joke goes, has nothing to do with teenagers in Japan. Euthanasia comes from the Greek, eu meaning good and thanatos meaning death, so literally a good death, usually referring to a mercy killing, killing the patient for the person's own good. Historically, doctors in the West have been skeptical of euthanasia. So if you go all the way back to ancient Greece, in the Hippocratic Oath, one of the maxims reads, "I will neither give a deadly drug to anybody who asks for it, nor will I make a suggestion to this effect." Euthanasia is also often considered to be a direct violation of what many people regard as the central principle of medical ethics, which is, above all, do no harm. The thought being, surely killing someone counts as harming them. That being said, this idea that a doctor's first responsibility is to do a patient no harm actually raises more questions than it might at first appear. That is it the case that killing the patient always counts as harming them? Is it ever the case that keeping a patient alive actually harms a person more than taking their life away does? First thing I want to do is draw your attention to some distinctions that often get made in connection to euthanasia. The first set of distinctions has to do with the agency of the physician or other medical provider. So the first category here is passive euthanasia. Essentially, this means letting a patient die when it's within your power to keep the patient alive, at least for some time longer. So letting the patient die by withholding treatment or perhaps by discontinuing treatment that you're already providing. This is especially likely to be considered a kind of euthanasia in certain kinds of circumstances. So, for example, if the patient is already in hospital care, you've been, for instance, you've had them on life support and now you're withdrawing life support. Or to give another example, if you have a newborn who it seems is not going to survive for very long, but you could keep the baby alive for longer on life support, and yet deciding to let the baby die rather than keep the baby alive as long as possible. So this is distinguished from active euthanasia, that is, euthanizing by means of actively killing the patient, for example, by administering a lethal injection. Most of the time, if people are speaking of euthanasia without qualification, what they have in mind is active euthanasia. One other category relevant to the agency of the medical provider is people sometimes talk about physician-assisted suicide or medically assisted suicide. These are cases where, for instance, the physician intentionally provides the patient with sleeping pills, say, to end her own life, though the patient herself performs the action of taking the pills. So the physician is helping the patient take her own life, but isn't himself performing the action that kills the patient. whether or not there is a meaningful moral difference between any of these, but especially, say, between active euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide is a matter of controversy. Some people think physician-assisted suicide is more acceptable than active euthanasia is, but others deny that distinction. The other set of distinctions I want to draw your attention to have to do with the voluntariness on the patient's part. So voluntary euthanasia refers to cases where a competent patient requests to be euthanized. And so these are the kinds of cases that come up most commonly. Classic kind of case would be a cancer patient who doesn't want to live any longer because of the great pain and discomfort that the patient's in, and so the patient requests to be helped to die. The obvious contrast with this is involuntary euthanasia, cases where a patient is euthanized against her will. Some people would consider this a misnomer, that there is no such thing as involuntary euthanasia, that if you are mercy killing someone against their will, then it's not really mercy killing. But as we'll see in a moment, it's historically important because what a lot of people worry about when discussing euthanasia are cases, for instance, from Nazi Germany, where doctors were licensed to perform mercy killings on, for instance, people with cognitive disabilities, even though the patients or their families never asked for it. The third category here is non-voluntary euthanasia. These are cases where the euthanized patient is incapable of giving or withholding consent, and yet the euthanasia is performed. So a paradigm case of this would have to do with an infant. If you thought that an infant was that the prospects for life were so bad and that the infant was going to undergo such extreme suffering that it was more merciful to just actively take the infant's life rather than let it linger on, that would be a case of non-voluntary euthanasia. It's not that the infant is protesting the euthanasia, but obviously it's just not even something that the infant can either ask for or refuse. There will be cases where it's controversial as to whether we're talking about voluntary euthanasia or non-voluntary euthanasia. So if you had a person whose competence was in question, maybe you're talking about a relatively young child, or you're talking about an Alzheimer's patient, whether they're giving or refusing, whether they're giving consent or refusing euthanasia when not competent sort of raises questions about whether this falls into the category of voluntary euthanasia, involuntary euthanasia, and non-voluntary euthanasia. We'll come to some of those issues a little bit further. The point is, it's not, all I want to say is it's not the case that any particular instance of helping a patient die is easy to fit into one of these categories, but people tend to think they're quite important. So for example, under the new Canadian law, voluntary euthanasia is permissible under some circumstances, but neither involuntary nor non-voluntary euthanasia is permissible. Some people think that there should be some cases of non-voluntary euthanasia permitted. Almost everyone agrees that straightforward involuntary euthanasia would be impermissible. But again, people argue about whether a particular case falls into one category or another. Now, whether you're talking about euthanasia or research ethics or eugenics, in all of these cases, some of the deepest fears about these practices come from horrible experiences from the Nazi regime. So in the case of euthanasia, we have action T4. So here there's this, I have this little note from Hitler, dated September 1st, 1939. Says, Reich leader Buhler and Dr. Brandt are charged with the responsibility of enlarging the competence of certain physicians designated by name so that patients who on the basis of human judgment are considered incurable can be granted a mercy death after discerning diagnosis. So this was essentially part of the Nazi program of improving the human race, that is, of eliminating by mercy killing certain people who are considered unfit to live, that were just a burden on society. So this is important to just be aware of, because what many people are concerned about is that by permitting euthanasia, what we're doing is at least taking the first steps down the road to a situation where we're eliminating undesirable individuals or people who we deem to be a burden on the rest of us. So at least in the cases of voluntary euthanasia, it looks like we're dealing with a type of suicide. So how should we think about the moral or legal status of suicide in general? Well, traditionally, in especially the Christian world, suicide was regarded as a sin and a crime. However, in most Western countries today, suicide is no longer technically a crime. That being said, it's not necessarily the case that you can just kill yourself and expect no one to interfere. Generally speaking, if someone is suicidal, then other people are considered justified to stop the person from killing themselves. And usually the person can be involuntarily committed to a mental hospital, at least temporarily, to prevent him from harming himself. So although the person would never be subject to criminal prosecution for attempting to kill themselves, they would, it is not the case that they can just usually kill you, that you can usually kill yourself and expect no one to intervene. Now, not only was suicide generally, that is historically, considered a crime, but also directly assisting someone to commit suicide has been considered a form of unlawful homicide. And even as the laws regarding suicide were liberalized, that is, once it was no longer a crime to kill yourself and you couldn't be prosecuted for doing so, the laws about assisted suicide did not change. It continued to be the case that you could be prosecuted for helping someone to kill themselves. And so this law, which is quite common throughout the world, especially in Western countries, is what was at issue in the Canadian Supreme Court cases about medical assistance in dying. In particular, it was what was at issue in Rodriguez v. British Columbia and in Carter v. Canada. Now, turning to the history of medical assistance in dying in Canadian law. So, once again, any sort of medical involvement in helping a patient die, any sort of assistance in voluntary euthanasia, had traditionally been forbidden in Canada, as in many other places, by the law against assisting someone else to commit suicide. So in Canada, this was specified by Section 241B of the Canadian Criminal Code. This section of the Criminal Code was challenged by Sue Rodriguez in the early 90s. Rodriguez was terminally ill. She had ALS, that is Lou Gehrig's disease, and Her argument was that Section 241B was inconsistent with Section 7 of the Canadian Charter, which provided that everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of a person, and the right not to be deprived thereof, except in accordance with the principles of fundamental justice. So her argument was that the law against anyone assisting a patient, the law against anyone assisting a person ending their own life was overly broad in these medical cases because it was depriving the person of this fundamental liberty. However, the court did not accept that argument in this 1993 case and upheld Section 241B. This, however, was relitigated just a few years ago in the case that was finally decided, Carter v. Canada, in 2014. This case began with another patient, Gloria Taylor. Taylor also was an ALS patient, and her suit was later joined by a number of other parties, including someone named Carter. That's the name of the case, Carter v. Canada. The Supreme Court in this case overturned Rodriguez, and it held that Section 241B of the Criminal Code unjustifiably infringes Section 7 of the Charter, and that this section is of no force or effect to the extent that they prohibit physician-assisted death for a competent adult person who first clearly consents to the termination of life, and two, has a grievous and irremediable medical condition, including an illness, disease, or disability that causes enduring suffering that is intolerable to the individual in the circumstances of his or her condition. So the upshot of the Carter v. Canada decision was that the existing law that prohibited you from helping someone in their own lives was overly broad when it came to medical assistance in dying, and that an exception in this respect needed to be carved out. But exactly what that exception would look like was a matter that was left to Parliament. And so Parliament passed in 2016 the Medical Assistance in Dying Act. So for our purposes, what's most interesting are the eligibility criteria for medical assistance in dying, or MAID, as it's known for short. So the law says a person may receive medical assistance in dying only if they meet all of the following criteria. First, you have to be eligible for health services funded by a government in Canada. Second, you have to be at least 18 years of age and capable of making decisions with respect to your own health. Third, you have to have a grievous and irremediable medical condition. Fourth, you have to have made a voluntary request for medical assistance in dying that in particular was not made as a result of external pressure. And fifth, you have to have given informed consent to receive medical assistance in dying after having been informed of the means that are available to relieve the suffering, including palliative care. So a few remarks about some of these criteria. First of all, why is it the case that you have to be eligible for health services funded by a government in Canada? Well, this is because Canada did not want to become a death tourism destination. Didn't want to become a country where people travel to this country to receive MAID if euthanasia wasn't legally permitted in their own country. That is something that's happened to some European countries that have been on the forefront of legalizing euthanasia. Part of some of these conditions, clearly what their point is to make sure that only voluntary euthanasia is permitted. Cases where a person who is competent has voluntarily requested the medical assistance in dying, and that they haven't been pressured and that their decision is informed. So not only is it certainly the case that Parliament didn't want there to be any cases of involuntary euthanasia. But the law is also written to prohibit non-voluntary euthanasia, cases where a person is simply not competent to make a decision about euthanasia, and yet they are killed for their own good. One thing that's interesting in that connection has to do with the requirement that you be at least 18 years of age. That's because in many provinces in Canada, and certainly in Ontario, you could be under the age of 18 and capable of making your own medical decisions, recognized by law as being competent to make your own medical decisions. So this means that if you were, say, 16 years old and you were dying of cancer, you might be competent in Ontario to make decisions about whether to continue or discontinue chemotherapy, say, but you may not be eligible to decide whether or not to receive MAID. Not only are you not capable of making the decision yourself, but no one else can make the decision for you either. It's not that people who are under 18 aren't able to make the decision for themselves, but this is a medical treatment that's simply not going to be performed for anyone under the age of 18. I think you can see why people are worried about medical assistance in dying for children and adolescents. But I think you could also see why some people think that this is a problem in the law as written, that if this is going to be something that's available to people who are competent to make their own decisions, then adolescents who are deemed competent to make their own decisions ought to be able to make this decision as well. May even be concerned that it's a mistake to categorically prohibit euthanasia for children who can't make their own decisions. You might think it was more merciful sometimes to end the child's life as quickly as possible rather than letting them suffer longer. We'll talk more about that kind of question in the next lecture. Again, kind of a straightforward concern is that you don't want people feeling pressured to make this decision, so we'll talk more about that also in the next lecture. The point of, informed consent, of course, is a cornerstone of clinical ethics today. The provision here is quite explicit that part of what informed consent is going to consist in for MAID is that you need to know about other options for relieving pain and suffering. In particular, you need to know about palliative care, hospice care, things of that matter, before you can make a decision to receive medical assistance in dying. So the next bit of the law says a little bit more about what's going to count as a grievous and an irremediable medical condition. So the law spells that out in the following way. One has to have a serious and incurable illness, disease, or disability. And this means that one has to, in addition, one has to be in an advanced state of irreversible decline in capability. The illness, disease, or disability, or the state of decline must be causing enduring physical or psychological suffering that is intolerable to them, and that cannot be relieved under conditions that they consider acceptable. And their natural death has to be reasonably foreseeable, taking into account all of their medical circumstances, without a prognosis necessarily having been made as to the specific length of time that they have remaining. So a couple of remarks about these conditions. First, the law is written so that medical assistance in dying is a medical treatment for diagnosable medical conditions. So one of the themes that we've seen recurring over this semester has to do with to what extent is medicine or medical services, to what extent are they provided to patients based on patient demand, and to what extent are they responses that the physician considers appropriate given the patient's condition. So we've seen a number of people arguing for the importance of medical practice being a response to diagnosable conditions. So think back to that article by Robert Schwartz about medical futility. Remember, in his fanciful example, the patient comes into the surgeon's office and says that he wants to have his arm removed. And when the surgeon asks, well, what's wrong with your arm? The patient simply says, well, nothing's really wrong with my arm. It's just that I've been sinning, and the only way I can avoid sinning, or the only way I can expiate for my sin, is to have my arm removed. And Schwartz imagines the surgeon saying, well, I'm sorry, but that's just not a medical condition that surgery is an appropriate treatment for. So we've seen a number of writers who think that it's important that medicine is not based on consumer demand, but is instead about providing professionally appropriate services for a medical problem. On the other hand, when we looked at the ethics of cosmetic surgery, or we're looking at issues around human enhancement, there's a certain perspective on those kinds of practices that says, look, as long as the patient wants whatever it is that the doctor can provide, there's no particularly good reason for the doctor not to provide that to the patient, as long as the patient is informed about their options. So what you have in the Canadian MAID law is an insistence that medical assistance in dying should be carefully circumscribed to responses to diagnosable medical conditions. What kind of pain or suffering is going to make you eligible for MAID? Well, you could imagine someone saying that we want to limit it only to physical suffering, but that's not the way the legislation here is written. It applies to both physical and psychological suffering. What matters is not the source of the suffering, as it were, but rather whether the suffering is intolerable to the patient. One reason why that's significant, I think, is that what is easiest to relieve under other means are certain forms of physical suffering. So what we're best at doing is, if you've got some kind of straightforward pain, we can medicate you enough often that you don't feel the pain. But that's not true for psychological suffering, and it may not be true for other kinds of discomfort as well. For instance, things like nausea can be much harder to treat. On the other hand, if you put this condition about suffering together with the last condition about a foreseeable death, you get a kind of, again, another restriction on the legislation. So it's not the case that just any kind of pain and suffering makes you eligible for MAID, but it has to be some kind of condition that is leading to your death, that your natural death is, in the wording of the law, has already become reasonably foreseeable. So that means a number of sources of physical suffering, but also all kinds of psychological suffering, like psychiatric illnesses, generally are not going to be considered appropriate medical conditions for MAID under existing Canadian law, because they're not leading to a reasonably foreseeable natural death. The law is a little bit more liberal than some laws, some existing laws uh, on medically assisted dying, because the there's not a precise time frame insisted upon. So under some laws that exist in other places, uh, doctors have to be convinced that you only have 6 months left to live. The Canadian law is more open and kind of vague on this point, that your natural death has become reasonably foreseeable. So maybe you have more than 6 months to live, but you could still be eligible um, for medical assistance in dying. Okay, now I want to start getting into some of the moral arguments for and against euthanasia. I'm going to begin with the doctrine of the sanctity of life. Anyway, that's the heading that I'll put these kinds of considerations under. This is the most categorical kind of rejection of euthanasia, the idea that killing is always wrong because life is such an important or sacred thing that it's just always wrong to destroy human life. Obviously, this is a view that is going to be relevant not only to euthanasia, but also to an issue like abortion. The idea that life is something sacred is an idea that's common to many moral and religious traditions. It's been particularly well articulated in Catholic thought. So what I've assigned to introduce us to these ideas is a document prepared by the Catholic Church, the Declaration on Euthanasia. As you'll see when you read it, some of the ideas are quite specifically Catholic, but I think the big picture is something that would be accepted by many Christians who aren't Catholics, also by many religious believers who aren't Christians, and even by some people who wouldn't consider themselves religious or wouldn't consider themselves theists at all. So in the Declaration on Euthanasia, the basic idea, the sort of foundational idea, is that human life is the basis of all goods and is the necessary source and condition of every human activity and all of society. Most people, according to the authors, regard life as something sacred and hold that no one may dispose of it at will. It adds that believers see in life something greater, namely a gift of God's love, which they are called upon to preserve and make fruitful. The implication of that is that intentionally causing one's own death or suicide is as equally as wrong as murder. Such an action on the part of the person is to be considered as a rejection of God's sovereignty and loving plan. If you want, you can try to put that in less Christian language or even less religious language. The idea that life is a gift or a good, and that there's something wrong about throwing away a life. If you like, you could set aside the issue of medical assistance in dying for a moment and ask yourself whether you think there's something wrong or tragic about ending one's own life. Don't worry about whether it's a sin or whether you should blame the person who's committed suicide. Just ask, is there something tragic about ending one's own life, or is it just a life option? Is it just something that some people want to get married, some people don't, some people want to retire early, some people don't, some people want to end their life early, some people don't. The position sketched in this document is that that would be the wrong attitude to take about it towards a human life. A human life is something that demands our respect, demands each individual's respect towards his or her own life. If the person fails to appreciate their life as a gift, even if it's not literally a gift from a god, even if it's just kind of a gift of nature. If you don't have that attitude towards life, then you're failing to take seriously the most important good available to us. So that, I think, is the basic idea of this sanctity of life, and it's supposed to explain why there's something as worrisome about suicide as there is about murder. There's something just wrong about throwing away a human life. So the Declaration on Euthanasia takes this idea about the sanctity of human life to support a categorical prohibition on any sort of killing of human beings. So in the words of the Declaration, nothing and no one can in any way permit the killing of an innocent human being, whether a fetus or an embryo, an infant or an adult, an old person or one suffering from an incurable disease, or a person who is dying. So clearly this is a viewpoint that has implications not only for euthanasia, but also for abortion. The Declaration goes on to say, furthermore, no one is permitted to ask for this act of killing, and nobody has the authority to help anyone else take their own life, even though they've been asked by that person to do so. Again, the way the Declaration puts it is, this is a question of a violation of divine law, an offense against the dignity of the human person, a crime against life, and an attack on humanity. So one question then you might have about the doctrine of the sanctity of life is, what is its legitimate scope of application, as it were? I suppose there's no question that it's a possible it's a possible set of beliefs and values that a person might hold in their own life, or that it might be a set of values that a medical professional might subscribe to, which informs the way that they practice medicine. So this, for instance, brings us back to the questions about conscientious objection in medicine. Someone who subscribed to the doctrine of the sanctity of life might have moral objection to participating in any sort of medical assistance in dying. But can this idea be expressed in a way that it is non-sectarian enough to be a legitimate ground for public policy in a pluralistic society like that in Canada? So this gets into questions of political philosophy that there's more to go into here than we can do so in this class. But when is it that religious values or religious beliefs are legitimate reasons for people to support or oppose something, not just in their own lives, but as a matter of public policy? You could also ask, does it make a difference as to whether you could express this idea in less theistic of language? So naturally, the Catholic Church's Declaration on Euthanasia is set within a theistic framework, idea about life being a gift from God. But would it change our views about how legitimate it was as a grounds for public policy if the idea was expressed in less theistic terms? So what if we just focused on the language about the dignity of the human person, or euthanasia being an attack on humanity, for example? Certainly, we're used to notions like crimes against humanity. Is it legitimate to argue about euthanasia in those terms? Again, I really just raised this question without intending to try to answer it for you, but that's the question. Are these ideas even if expressed in a non-theistic way, too sectarian or too controversial to be applied to public policy, or might they be permissible grounds of public policy if at least put in a sufficiently inclusive way? And because life is regarded as a gift by the Declaration on Euthanasia, the implication is that not only is there a prohibition on active euthanasia, but there's also a problem with letting oneself die unnecessarily. So the Declaration reads that everyone has a duty to care for his or her own health or to seek such care from others. So in other words, there's no general right to refuse treatment, or to put it another way, you aren't justified in seeking your own death through inaction any more than you're justified in seeking your own death through some kind of active, some sort of active means. That being said, the Declaration wants to draw a distinction between ordinary treatments and extraordinary or heroic or experimental treatments. The idea is that it's not necessarily the case that you are required to avail yourself of every possible medical remedy. And what we're especially concerned with here are cases at the end of life. So it's not the case that when a patient is dying, they are morally obliged, according to the doctrine of the sanctity of life, to avail themselves of any possible way of prolonging their life by any degree, any amount of time possible. But the thought is that there is something wrong with, again, intentionally causing your own death by not taking action that you could ordinarily take. So again, there's this distinction drawn between the ordinary and extraordinary treatments. So exactly how to draw the distinction is a difficult question, but I think you can see the idea behind the distinction. So for example, a patient who's dying from cancer and might be able to extend their life by 6 months with another round of chemotherapy, but it's not going to extend it any longer, and it's going to cause considerable suffering while the patient, during that extended period of life. The patient may not be required to avail themselves of that kind of treatment. On the other hand, a patient who refuses antibiotics, say, or even more egregiously, someone who refuses food and water because they want to die. Maybe it's a hospital patient who wants to die. That would generally be considered unjustified by the doctrine of the sanctity of life. So again, the bottom line is that patients not required to undergo extremely burdensome treatments with little hope of success, or treatments that do no more than prolong the dying process, but there is a general requirement not only to not kill others or not ask others to kill you, but not to intentionally injure life through an act of omission. The Declaration on Euthanasia then raises this question, which is put in the mouths of the doctors. The question is the suppression of pain and consciousness by the use of narcotics permitted by religion and morality to the doctor and the patient, even if one foresees that the use of narcotics will shorten life? And so the response in the Declaration on Euthanasia to this question is this. In this case, death is in no way intended or sought, even if the risk of it is reasonably taken. The intention here is simply to relieve pain effectively, using for this purpose painkillers available to medicine. So this is, once again, the doctrine of double effect. I mentioned this briefly earlier in the discussion of abortion. But the idea of the doctrine of double effect is it's sometimes permissible to bring about a foreseeable bad effect, that is, in this case, death, if it's the unavoidable side effect of the intended good effect, in this case, the relief of pain. So there may be cases in which there's a patient who's suffering. The only way to relieve their suffering is to give them a high dose of narcotics, but there is the foreseeable risk that if you give the patient a sufficiently high dose of the narcotics, that it's going to kill the patient, that it's going to suppress the vital functions enough that the patient dies. So the question is, if you know that that is a reasonably foreseeable possible outcome, is it wrong to administer the narcotics in that case? And so what the doctrine of double effect says is that no, it's not wrong if it's really the case that it wasn't your intention to end the life of the patient, but it's the unavoidable side effect of the good you were trying to bring about, which in this case is the relief of pain. Now, it's important here that you are sincere in what your intention was. You can't, according to this, on this perspective, it would be wrong to cheat, to think, well, I'm allowed to prescribe narcotics to relieve pain, so I'm going to prescribe more than I have to in order to put the patient out of their misery and help them die. And that would be impermissible. It's only when the action, it's only when the bad outcome, in this case death, is the unavoidable side effect of the good that you're trying to bring about, and it's a legitimate good. Again, one thing to say about the doctrine of double effect is it's not to be confused with the distinction between doing and allowing. What's central to the doctrine of double effect is this distinction between intending an outcome and foreseeing an outcome. So there can be cases that involve both actions and omissions, which involve intending or foreseeing. So for example, you might find that a certain kind of, like keeping the patient on the respirator is causing the patient immense pain. And so the only way to relieve the patient's suffering is by taking them off of the respirator. You might consider that as a withdrawal of treatment. It could be considered a kind of omission, a kind of passive euthanasia. That might be justifiable if, even if it's foreseeably going to bring about the patient's death, if you'd be perfectly happy if it didn't kill the patient. What you're trying to accomplish is just cessation of the pain caused by the treatment. Similarly, there can be cases where your intention is to let the patient die by not administering treatment. That would not be permitted according to the doctrine of double effect. It doesn't matter whether it's an omission or a commission. The question is, was your decision based on the intention to bring about death, whether by acting or not acting, or was death simply a foreseeable consequence of an action that you undertook for other reasons? So that's the doctrine of double effect, and it plays a large role in the way that people who subscribe to the idea of the sanctity of life would think about certain end-of-life decisions. It's never permissible to intentionally bring about death, but it is sometimes permissible to do something that can foreseeably bring about death, because it's the only way to bring about some other good consequence, like relief of pain. So that brings me to the end of my discussion of the doctrine of sanctity of life. Next time we'll look at two other kinds of arguments about euthanasia, those which appeal directly to the autonomy of the patient to make their own decisions about medical care, and questions about whether euthanasia is partly justified because of the good that it does the patient, in particular with the alleviation of suffering. Okay, so I'll pick it up there next time.